we focus on the global aspects of our mission. I know of no one better prepared to do so than Dr. Timothy Tennent. Dr. Tennent has been an important voice in the area of missions, intercultural studies, global Christian education, global theological education for so many years. First, as a faculty member at Gordon Conwell Seminary. Secondly, as president at Asbury Theological Seminary, where for the past 15 years he has given extraordinary leadership. If you've watched the development and strengthening of that institution. And now, having retired from Asbury, technically not retired, but just stepping away from the presidency, to back into the classroom as the Methodist professor at Beeson Divinity School. Timothy Tennent is a graduate of Oral Roberts University, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, Princeton Theological Seminary, and the well-earned PhD from the University of Edinburgh. He's written widely in this area. If you know his work on Invitation to World Mission, or my favorite, Theology from a Global Perspective, a work that I've used in my systematic theology classes many times, you know that he is engaging and thoughtful, and we are in for a treat to hear him today. Also shows the fairness and breadth of the IACE. We just heard a Reformed voice, now a Wesleyan one, and we're all united around the center of our faith we confessed together last night. So Dr. Timothy Tennent, you come. It is our privilege to welcome you to the IACE podium. Join me in welcoming him this morning.
Thank you so much, and it is an honor to follow Don Sweeting, my good friend. Wesleyan should always follow Reformed theologians. It's only right, but it's great to be here. Thank you so much. Everyone in this room, including your children and your grandchildren, even those who have not yet been born, are all living or will live on a major fault line in the history of human civilization. I think Don's address pointed us to this. If history is divided into major epochs like ancient, medieval, and modern, it's indeed exceedingly rare to live your life and your ministry on such a fault line. The ancient world lasted from 3000 BC to 476, the sacking of Rome, according to our history books, but what we don't often remember is that the ancient world went into a serious crisis in the year 290 AD, which was called at the time the imperial crisis. Some of this called by historians the 3rd century crisis, where the Roman Empire became increasingly unstable due to massive immigration, foreign invasions, and civil war, eventually leading to the collapse of Rome in 476, which is kind of the history marking point. But we shouldn't forget, though, that there was actually a 186-year period of complete volatility. It was a period of tremendous, things were messy and turbulent before it finally gave birth to what became known as the medieval world. The medieval world started with the fall of Rome in 476 and continued to the end of the Black Plague, their version of COVID-19 times 100 in the 14th century. But something was happening, would eventually happen in Florence, which would give birth to the Renaissance, and huge epic events that eventually led to the modern world is the Reformation, the upheaval of the ensuing religious wars. We often tell the Reformation, and rightfully so, we celebrate it from a theological point of view because of all the wonderful things that were restored, but it's also the period of religious wars where it left 11 to 20 million people dead in Europe. And finally gave birth to the Enlightenment, which has shaped so much of how we understand higher education, so many of the assumptions and plausibility structures which our institutions accept as givens in our world. And we've now passed onto the fault line of this transition to a new, as yet unnamed period that we clumsily call postmodernity. Now, some scholars date the beginning of postmodernity with the publication of the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard in his 1979 article entitled "The Postmodern Condition, a Report on Knowledge." Now, in that article, he coined the term postmodern in the way that we use it in today's discourse. And he said things that you all be familiar with, but he's pointed out that the fundamental shift of our time, he argued, is a growing crisis of truth, the collapse of what he called the grand narratives, which provided order, stability, and so forth to society, meaning to society, and the fracturing of the Enlightenment project, which again Don alluded to just now. Signaled by, he calls it, the loss of belief in the power of reason and the growing pessimism about the perfectibility of humanity. Now, like a lot of philosophical writings, 1979, this went unnoticed by the larger world. But a popular book was written in 1982, and many of you will remember this book by John Nesbitt, entitled Megatrends. Now, this book sold more than 9 million copies, was number one on the New York Times bestseller list for 2 straight years. And I was one of those readers in 1982. I meant to put my copy in my bag because I still have my 1982 copy of Megatrends. And I still remember how it felt as a person reading. I was in college when it came out. I was reading this book, and it seemed so futuristic. It was like the Jetsons. Am I you too old with the Jetsons? Okay, whatever. Futuristic. Let me read you the table of contents of the megatrends that John Nesbitt highlighted, and it'll be like a yawner to you. This is what he said, which seemed like a Jetsons cartoon to me in 82. From industrial society to information society, forced technology, high-touch technology, national economy to world economy, centralization to decentralization, hierarchies to networking, north to south, either or to multiple choice options. You get the point. Now, over 40 years later, books like Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat or Neil Howe's recent New York Times, again bestseller, The Fourth Turning is Here, have made a compelling case that the whole world has now entered into this fault line, not just the West, of this new period that we don't know yet what will happen. Now, along the way, we've seen, as Don so beautifully pointed out, we have come upon the dramatic rise of the prefix post. Phrases like post-enlightenment, post-Western, post-communist, post-dominational, post-industrial, postmodern, and I think Don mentioned like 7 others. And on it goes. The prefix post doesn't really say anything except that we know we're beyond what we once knew. But the truth be told, we don't know really where we're going, so we just use the word post. I guess if we lived during the imperial crisis of the 3rd century, we could have coined the term post-ancient. Or perhaps during the Reformation, we could release a best-selling book, Life in a Post-Medieval World. The point is, we must recognize that we're on a seam of history, and whatever challenges we're facing in higher education or in the culture of society at large, it means that we are living, it must be understood within the context of what it means to live on a major fault line in the history of civilization. They are marked inevitably by instability and even chaos. And the fact that Katie this morning in our beautiful devotional pointed out that 40% of our young people say that they don't feel like that there's anything, that things are just falling apart, is what she said, because they are. We're on a fault line in history. Now, this is really important backdrop to the 2 mega trends, if you want to use that term, that I want to highlight this morning that are facing Christian educators today. But I think it's important to recognize the 2 I want to highlight. It'd be a mistake to say, well, these are what I think are the 2 most important things. No, I'm saying there's 25 other things which are influencing all of our work. But these are the 2 that I want to focus on in relationship to higher education and like to my topic, which is the relationship of global Christianity and higher education. Now, I want to just say before, I hope there hasn't been like a theme of too much pessimism. So let me just say one little maybe side comment about all of this. During the last two major epical seasons of the church's transition from the ancient world to the medieval world, medieval to the modern world, the church did quite well. In fact, it was a time of great flourishing for the church. I mean, when the Roman Empire collapsed, think about it from the Christian point of view. Okay, we just lost the Constantinian peace. We lost the Edict of Milan. Everything seemed to be lost for them, but they didn't say that. They said, no, we are going to convert the, quote, so-called barbarians, and they did. And by the way, they made far better Christians than the Romans ever did. And then later, 1,000 years later, when the next crisis happened, that's when we have the Reformation. And so the church has done really well because the church is a beacon of light, a beacon of transcultural light, of stability in the midst of chaos, and people will see it in the midst of the storm. So I have a lot of hope about this period, a lot of hope. But nevertheless, I still think we have to recognize that in the midst of this, we have some big challenges. So the first trend I want to mention is this: the simultaneous rise of a post-Christian West and a post-Western Christianity. Now this means that we're experiencing two simultaneous and seismic shifts moving in opposite directions regarding the demographics of where Christians are located in the world. So just to give you a little picture, since 1970, the Western world has averaged, based on the year, between 3,400 and 6,500 people leaving the church every single day on average. That means just during this conference, right now, this year, we think it's going to be around 4,000. So that means just during this conference, when you arrive, when you go home, be 12,000 fewer Christians in U.S. and North America and Canada. 12,000 fewer than when you arrived here every single day since 1970. Now, we've also seen the collapse, and this is what, again, Dr. Sweeting, basically the collapse of the Christendom Project, which, of course, in the U.S. is kind of the legal, constitutional, not the legal form, but the kind of civil religion. And we're now in a context of the post-Christian West. And that's all happened basically in our lifetime. We're in this room. But the story is not simply one of the recession or the withering away of the Christian gospel. This has happened in our history multiple times. North Africa once had 50 Christian bishops. The Middle East was once the heartland of Christianity. Constantinople was once the heartland. All those recessions have happened over the course of history. But what is unique is that we're simultaneously experiencing the greatest surge of Christian faith in history, and it's happening in a polycentric way. So, for example, these same days we're here where the U.S. will lose 4,000 people today, or North America, 4,000 today, 4,000 tomorrow, 4,000 next day. Sub-Saharan Africa will gain 10,000 today, 10,000 tomorrow, 10,000 the day after that. It'll be 30,000 more African Christians than when you arrived here. And it's been some years as many as 16,000. It's currently cooled to about 10,000 a year, but we'll take that cool. Now, the 16th century Reformation has now come to Latin America. And Pentecostalism and independent Christianity is changing the face of Christianity in Latin America before our eyes, even though the demographics are relatively the same, almost identical in the last 50 years. In the Reformation, even the counter-Reformation equivalent is happening in the Roman Catholic Church in Latin America. No single country can match the growth of the church in China, which in our latest study at Lausanne determined that in this century alone, it's gone from around 1 million to 100 million Christians in China. Think about it. India, 40 million Christians. These were all once the mission field, now producing millions of new Christians. And many of those Christians in India, where I worked, are happening, those church planting movements in the heart of Hindu North India. I could go on, but the point is that the growth is multi-continental. It is not centered in any one place. And that's, as far as we know, unique in the history of Christianity. We generally had recessions in one place and advanced in another place, but never a recession that then went to every other place. as we call this in missiology, polycentric Christianity, what the great African theologian John Beatty called multiple centers of universality. So these two shifts are happening simultaneously. So on the one side, everywhere in the world, everywhere in the world where Europeans and European descent people, this would be Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, North America, etc., everywhere where Europeans are living in diaspora or in Europe is the church in decline. There's no exceptions. That's the post-Christian West. On the other hand, there's a remarkable vibrancy unfolding around the world where Christianity is being rediscovered apart from the West, that is post-Western Christianity. So what is fascinating is despite this dramatic shift in the center of gravity, and this is where it really becomes, I think, the point we have to grapple with. The center of Christian gravity is one story. It's like a historical story. It's a thing that's happening. We're observing it over the last 50 years especially. But the center of Christian education remains centered in the Western world. The largest faculties, the largest schools, the highest offered degrees in theological education remain in the Western world. Never before in history have the richest theological resources, books, libraries, endowments, developed theological faculty be found squarely in the midst of an emerging mission field. Furthermore, we have to go back to the work of the 16th century reformers in Europe and, frankly, the expansion of the Roman Catholics in Latin America under the Jesuits to find a time when the church was growing so rapidly in places simply did not have the theological infrastructure in order to sustain the church. This is remarkable. For example, the number of ACTE accredited schools in Africa that offer graduate level theological degrees can be counted on your fingers. Access to doctoral level education in India can be counted on one hand. A similar situation is true in China, and even then, only if you count Hong Kong and Taiwan. In contrast, as you know, the ATS has 278 member schools, all of which offer graduate degrees. The vast majority of those in this room are all full-time Christian educators, whereas of the 48,000 Christian educators and educations around the world in training centers, only 6.4% are full-time. So the center of theological education is quite oddly now centered in the midst of an emerging mission field. That is unprecedented. The second major trend is that we're in the middle of the largest human migration in history. Now, we often cite the Great Atlantic Migration between 1840 and 1913 as the greatest migration wave in history. This, of course, is the Statue of Liberty. Give me you're tired, you're poor. It was a remarkable time in our history. And just to give you the numbers on it, during that period, it's a pretty short period, 73 years, 17 million people moved to the United States. 17 million people immigrated here in that time. Of course, in waves, Germans, Norwegians, Swedes, Irish, etc. It was unprecedented, surpassing the Aryan migrations in the North India in the ancient world, which is another famous one, or the invasions of the Germanic tribes, which destabilized the ancient world I mentioned earlier, the Ostrogoths, the Franks, the Angles, the Saxons, the Burgundians, etc., which ushered in the medieval period. Now, none of that compares to what's unfolding in our time, not even close. To give you some perspective, when I was born, there were 12 million people in the entire world, 12 million, who lived in a country outside of their birth. Okay, so that you look at the whole world, 12 million people were no longer living in the country they were born in. Today, it's estimated that 281 million people live outside the country of their birth. 281 million. There were 26, in 1949, before I was born, but in 1949, there were 26,000 international students in the U.S. on F1 visas. Okay, today, there are over 1 million students on F1 visas in the U.S. It's actually around almost close to 1.1 now. And that's F1. That's not counting B2, people coming, for short-term conferences and intensives, all of that. These are people on F1 visas. 1.1 million. Think about it. The Chinese, the South Koreans, the Indians, students from Anglophone Africa, there's 24 of the 54 countries in Africa are English-speaking, are showing up in your classrooms, and that's going to increase dramatically as the years go on. Now, everyone in this room is at least broadly aware these developments I'm mentioning have been in conversation points for some time. Back in 1986, the ATS declared their 35th biennial meeting they declared the 1990s the decade of globalization, they called it. It was under the theme of global challenges and perspectives in theological education. The keynote address was given by Kenyan Cardinal Arinze, and he pointed out 6 big challenges or trends which he wanted or focused on for the globalization of seminaries. This later led to there were 13 case studies that were launched across the ATS of schools to think about how we would respond to all these changes they were talking about in '86. And I went back and reread all those case studies to see what were our schools. It was almost all the schools in this room. What were we talking about in '86? What did we say was going to happen? What were we going to do about it? And it reads like they were in the first inning of a baseball game. Or since we're trying to be global, first inning of a soccer match. The seminaries were just beginning to warm up to the real challenges that we now face in full force. Now, looking back on it, it seems like, and it's not a criticism, a lot of it was symbolic stuff they did. A lot of it was window dressing. It was really not a lot of fundamental changes to think about what does it mean to actually understand what the global face of Christianity looks like. Because actually it was during that time, it was actually 3 years before that ATS meeting, '86, when for the first time in the world, the number of majority world Christians outnumbered the number of Western Christians, just numerically. And of course, that's been going on dramatically. You mentioned earlier, the losses in the West, the gains around the world have dramatically shifted that a lot. Now we're only a third of the global Christian movement. So since the 1980s, there were 37 editions of the Journal of Theological Education, which were dedicated in some way to aspects of this conversation, by my assessment. Not to mention a lot of investments from the Pew Foundation and the Lilly Endowment to explore what was in those days called globalization. Now it's been eclipsed by better language like the Global South or Majority World Christianity. And I just want to ask the question, how are we doing? What have we missed? And where do we go from here? So just a few points about where I think what's happened and where we are at this point. We'll say we're now in halftime when we make a little assessment of where we are. First, there's no doubt that many of our schools have become much more diverse and globally minded than they were that many years ago, 40 years ago. It's definitely beyond, for most, not all schools, beyond token hires to very substantial change in how searches are done, how hiring processes happen in institutions. There's been a lot of things that have changed in the last 40 years. Our faculties do look different, many of them. But the diversity of the faculty not always translated into deep changes in how we teach and how we grapple with the new questions which the majority world is posing to Scripture. You can't simply take somebody from India, bring them here, train them, send them back, and pretend that the context is not different. Second, it's been widely observed that on the whole, the global church is more committed to historic orthodoxy than many of their sister schools in the West. It's not completely true, but it's largely true. But what has been less reported is that the curriculum, and more important, the theological vision, the theological imagination of majority world preparatory schools, Bible college and seminaries, are significantly more integrated than their Western counterparts. Now, this is where Scott Ray and Rick Langer's talk last night is really important to call back to mind. What I'm saying is that challenge which they set forth, and absolutely it's true, that challenge is different and experienced differently in contexts that never had the Enlightenment. And there's a natural sense of integration that goes on. Now, as their faculties get larger and they get trained in the West and so forth, all that changes. That is changing a lot. But in so many schools, it has not changed, and it's very, very powerful. In our kind of turf-protected silos, known as our discipline, we've been resistant to the kind of integration across disciplines which has been more normative for many schools around the world. And I've taught in them. I know this is true. It's actually our majority world friends which will show us the way to break free from what David Tracy famously called the three great separations of modern Western culture, end quote, all of which, he laments, are served to separate the task of theological education from the actual ministry context. According to Tracy, these three fatal separations are: one, the separation of feeling and thought, the separation of form and content, and the separation of theory and practice. This is the nut we haven't been able to crack because we ourselves have lived inside the Enlightenment nut. But now we're moving to a post-Enlightenment phase, and with all the challenges we're facing in this seam of history, the Enlightenment project has finally been exposed for its weaknesses that it has. And we're finally able to allow our brothers and sisters in the majority world to lead us into the very integration that we have espoused but has so doggedly eluded us. Though it will mean probably dismantling and changing a lot of ways that we understand the way we organize our educational systems and disciplines. Thirdly, in the ensuing years, it also became clear that the dichotomy between local, what we do here, and global, what they do there, just doesn't make sense anymore. We still think in those terms, but it just simply doesn't make sense. Today, all local has become global, global is increasingly local, and we often cite this as a legacy of technology, which of course is part of it. We are globally connected that way, but it's also a result of the migration in general and immigration to the U.S. in particular. So just for example, I'll just mention two countries, China and India, the two most populated countries in the world. And India, by the way, was so excited when they passed China as the most populated country in the world. So on behalf of all my Indian friends, just for the record, China is 1.42 billion, India is 1.44 billion, and they're proud of that. But 6 million Chinese descent live now in the U.S. 6 million Indians live in the U.S. As told me. In fact, the U.S. is the only country in the world that has members of every other country in the world in it. This means the U.S. has a particularly important role in understanding how globalization happens in terms of higher education. So in light of all this, where do we go from here? I have 4 brief suggestions. First, we must have a serious retooling of our faculties, not just in terms of their ethnicity and all that, that's important, but they must become better acquainted with scholarship emerging from the majority world. It's not enough to simply sprinkle our faculties with recruits from around the world, but we must become much more globally conversant in our own scholarship. In my own research, in my theology in the context of world Christianity, I discovered amazing things being written about by majority world scholars, which moves Christian theology from being kind of hyphenated theologies, which is what we mostly experience, Dalit theology, Minjung theology, liberation theology, post-colonial theology, all of that, to actually know these are contributions made to historic, orthodox, biblical Christianity that enriches and exposes our weaknesses and helps all of our theological discourse be better. A lot of wonderful things have come out in recent years, like the multi-ethnic commentary that got the CT award, the New Testament color, and the African Bible commentary are highlighting voices which you can then become acquainted with and learn. John Beatty, considered one of the pioneers of African Christian theology. And by the way, if you haven't read their works on Christology, it's unbelievable, their work on Christology. But he once lamented how Africans had dutifully traveled to eminent European and North American theological institutions for higher studies without finding any corresponding interest in their own theological reflections. Beatty said, and I quote, "We have eaten theology with you. We have drunk theology with you. We have dreamed theology with you. But it's all been one-sided. It's all been, in a sense, your theology. We know you theologically. The question is, do you know us theologically? Would you like to know us theologically?" End quote. The answer is that we really haven't wanted to know much about the theological reflections of the majority world Christians. Beatty went on to point out, he says, quote, "It's utterly scandalous for students of Western theology to know more about the theology of heretics long dead they do about the living theology of hundreds of millions of living Africans today." Clearly, the borders of theological discourse can no longer afford to stay within the perimeters, the familiar perimeter of Western discourse. By the way, the number one language of Christianity today, by far, if you took the whole church and reduced it to 100 people and said, what does a church look like? If you look at the languages, 16 of the 100 would speak Spanish. 12 would speak English. Spanish is now the largest spoken language of Christianity in the world. But if you look at the books published in English versus books published in Spanish, Chinese, Hindi, etc., it is a very telling point. There is a need for developing that scholarship. When I was in India, I founded an organization that all they did was translate books into Hindi and to develop Hindi writers. It's such an important thing. Secondly, we must engage in a new level of partnership which is fully bidirectional, multivocal, and co-equal. In the past, so much of partnerships were driven in the West by economic disparities and created power differentials. But today, when we have both the students around the world, they have the students and the pedagogical and the integrative expertise we've talked about, we now can enter the global stage as true partners. We must enter into much more bilateral exchanges based on relationships and shared vision. When I was president of Asbury, we opened up training sites in collaboration with schools in Bangalore, India, and Colombia, South America. And it was a remarkable way to engage in a whole other group of students. I never forget the first time we worked at IACE in South India, and they said to us, how many students do you want? Right? I never gotten that question from the Western world, believe me. How many students do you want? Third, our own seminaries and divinity schools must regain our missional footing. And think about it, if we go back to Ephesians, we have the fivefold ministry there, or fourfold based on how you understand the text. And the point is, we have focused on two of those, pastors and teachers. Or if you believe that's the one we focus on one thing, pastors and teachers. That is a Christendom model. That assumes the ordination requirements. It assumes churches wanting to receive our ordinands who go into, we're the gatekeepers for ministry in the church, all of that. That is a model that is passing away. And so if you focus on that, then you are going to decline. But if you focus on also training evangelists and church planters, it changes the whole conversation. When I was at Asbury, we decided in 2010 we were going to train 1,000 church planters, and we trained 1,000 church planters between 2010 and 2020. It's a really wonderful opportunity to open up to the full, and by the way, those church plants all need pastors. And so now we can provide pastors for them, see? That's the way the whole thing works. It's amazing, opportunities around the world. Fourthly, we have to move to a new economic viability model. Now, we all know that most of us don't currently serve institutions with viable, sustainable economic models. And the reason is because we are in the market driven by tuition revenue. So we've all engaged in some form, I'm not sure about all of you, but most of us have engaged some form of red ocean strategy where we increasingly have competition for an ever-diminishing pool of students. If you took every student in the whole of North America in seminaries, it makes this essentially the student body of the University of Ohio State. It's not a big pool of people, and we're competing for that ever-diminishing pool of people, which is getting smaller every year. Rather than a blue ocean strategy, which identifies vast groups of people all over the world who need a theological education. Remember the disparity. The schools are here, the students are there. In my experience, and I have 15 years work on this area, it is a lot easier, abundantly easier, to raise money for a scholarship for an international student, whether we teach them here or there, than to raise a tuition dollar from an ever-decreasing pool of students. It's always fascinating to hear a majority of world people, when they come around us, within 5 minutes, we talk about how much we are lacking in resources. And they have learned to reverse engineer most of what we do and do it for a fraction of the cost. We also have to move beyond the idea that, and this is where I think, to your credit, this is where you have been so helpful in making this point to the church, but it has been made stronger, is that Seminary can't be viewed as a 2-year place you pack your bag for a lifetime journey, or a 3-year equipping where you pack your bag for a lifetime journey. We have to be able to do ongoing education throughout ministry because we are in this period of instability. When I went through seminary in the early 80s, no one would have imagined the things we're facing today. So we have to have new lifelong learning models, discrete degree, certificate program, micro certification. All of that is wonderful for ongoing training and retooling ministry, and those students will inevitably help us in our integration issues as well. So in conclusion, we are in a wonderful but scary kairos moment in the history of theological education in the West. We don't have time to get caught up in a kind of the narrative of despair which happened in the hallways of our professional gatherings. We must remember afresh that the church has done very well in times of cultural instability. In fact, we have flourished the most during those times. If the cross of Jesus Christ teaches us anything, is that God does his greatest work under a cloak of failure. Brothers and sisters, if we capture a whole new vision of new models of education and faculty deployment, we can move joyfully from the Ichabod of despair to the Emmanuel of hope. And there are many new faces of Christian church around the world who are asking nothing less of us. Thank you very much.
So I confess that you have me completely intrigued by integration in the majority world culture. I wonder if you could just give us a few kind of tangible examples of what that looks like, because I'm all in and excited. I'd love to just get a little bit more particularity what that.
Give me one example. I'll give you 2 examples. One example would be that the traditional 3-year program, the school where I taught in North India, in Dehradun, North India, New Theological College, what we would call the MDiv, they don't call it MDiv, but our kind of MDiv type of degree there is 4 years, because you go 2 years to school, the entire 3rd year you're on the field out in the ministry, and then you come back for the 4th year. It creates unbelievable, because now they come back, oh, now we know, we understand. So all things we're talking about. So in other words, the integration is worked into the very thing. Not to mention their version of like mentor ministry is a very, very deep and involved thing there. Second thing they do is they go out and we did this, like we do surveys of, in our case, Hindus, of church planters. We ask them, what is the number one question a Hindu asks you when you come into a village in North India? I collected the answers to this for 2 years. I collected the answers, and the good news is we found out that even though there's 900 million Hindus, there weren't 900 million different questions. The Hindus asked the same questions over and over and over again. There were 15 questions that were particularly asked a lot by Hindus, and not one of those was addressed by our curriculum. So a student was graduating this is the fatal separation I mentioned that Tracy mentions. There was a disconnect because the school was set up according to the Western model in its original days. So we said, okay, let's make it more integrated to where you actually meet people what are the questions they have. And so if we actually took the time to say what are the top 15 questions that a postmodern millennial would have, it might affect our curriculum. So that's I think they were much more in conversation with because they're on a mission field in themselves, because Christians are very tiny in North India, but the whole program was designed toward more integration.
Thank you for your presentation. It was excellent. My big question is have you noticed the gap that happens when someone comes from the majority world to one of the institutions here? What do you do as they get more and more educated and they almost become educated beyond the context that they come from. And then some of them desire to stay, or they've found that this is a preferable place to be to do work in ministry. How have you been able to close that gap? And then at the same time, back in the setting there, say if it's an extension program or some sort of seminary that's been set up there, the big gap that comes between, well, it doesn't meet our accreditation standards with the education that's being supplied. So what are some of your suggestions on facing those problems?
Yeah, those are real problems, and that would take a lot of time. I would say that in terms of students coming here, I think there is a really important burden of the selection process. So we found, generally speaking, if someone comes here with no ties, no reputation from their home country, they likely will not come back. So I think it does involve choosing the right people to bring to the West. And I think it's important to have, we do offer amazing opportunities here for people around the world to go back and build seminaries around the world. So the purpose of this is to train people to go back and start Bible colleges, start seminaries, not just have them train here. But the other thing is to actually go and train them there. So in the Asbury world, we send our faculty to Bangalore, sent to Colombia. I've been all over the world teaching in those programs. So in that sense, they are remaining in their context. They're not, they solves the visa problem. So there's no, the ATS does allow you to go and extend your degrees in other parts of the world. And therefore you can do that, but you have to have your faculty actually go there. And we do get some professors there that are approved to be on our faculty, or you get professors of record, where someone is the professor of record and someone teaches portions of the course for them. But teaching there is very, very helpful for that problem. Okay, well, I better stop, otherwise I might break into a song, which would definitely be depressing. So thank you very much for your kindness.